Right. Welcome, Margaret Brearley. We're absolutely delighted that you're able to talk to us this evening, sharing your varied interests, passions, and hope for the future, and interweaving all the different things into what I think will be an amazing necklace of interests. So it's also a unique opportunity to connect with you because we're all sad that you're leaving Muswell Hill, but we're all excited for you to go on to the next adventure, which we know is going to be really meaningful for you to be being closer to your grandchildren. And also, I'm going to just make a little plug that you have recently been elected to the very prestigious Athenaeum Club in London, which is a centre for artists and literary people and politicians and everybody by merit and not by any kind of
bribery.
Well, whatever, right. So we know that you've got all kinds of things that you're going to be doing in the future that will be exciting. So, but for those who may not be aware, and I certainly wasn't, Margaret studied at Oxford, Cambridge, and Muenster in Germany. She lectured for 13 years on medieval and Renaissance German literature at Birmingham University. She also concurrently opened and ran a day centre for mentally ill people. And then she left academic life to set up and run the West Midlands Information Centre.
Israel Information Centre.
Oh, Israel Information, and then returned to London to become, returned to academia to become senior fellow at Selly Oak Colleges Centre for Judaism and Jewish-Christian Relations. Just making sure people aren't still trying to get in, right. And research fellow at London's Institute of Jewish Affairs. She's also led WITSO. She's lectured internationally and published on themes that include, and we will hear something about it this evening, Wagner, genocide, Roma Gypsies, the Shoah, torture, Judaism and Zionism. She has made programs for Granada TV, judged the Times Preacher of the Year Awards, and consulted on films and documentaries. Then, after losing her eldest son Joshua to sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, known as SADS, in 2002, she became involved in the Compassionate Friends, a national peer support charity for bereaved parents, which has helped hundreds and hundreds of people, and she chaired and ran it full-time for 3 years. Margaret, you are a completely amazing person. We are delighted that you're going to speak to us, and I now hand over to you.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, Judith, and thank you for all that you do in bringing us together in so many ways in the shul. I haven't had a glittering career like many of you have, and I haven't had a really straightforward career either, for reasons which will be obvious. It's been sort of raggle-taggle. So I'm going to give you, my splendid husband is bringing some tea. Thank you. Thank you, darling.
Evening all.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you sort of little gobbets of things which I hope won't be boring and as varied as possible. I thought I might start with just mentioning studying in Germany, because it was very different studying at a German university from an English one. I was a postgrad, and in Germany, lectures started for medical students at 6 o'clock in the morning, for the rest of us at 8 o'clock in the morning, but one could go to absolutely any lecture. So I could go to lectures on history or art or architecture. I went to lectures on terrorism. They were the best attended in the university. And whereas at Oxford, everybody was practicing
and then you can go and use the iPad.
lecture halls for Isaiah.
Or go and watch football and have a shower.
In Muenster, they were packed in to have lectures on terrorism. And I have still got the notes on how to paralyze a city by simultaneous terrorist action. I have full notes on anarchic theory and all of, it was quite extraordinary. I was a rather religious Christian. I ran a religious bookstall opposite the Trotskyites. So I read quite a lot of Trotskyism, and I even joined a Trotskyite cell to try and understand them for a while before I was thrown out. And it was my introduction to a very different mindset in which ideology is terribly, terribly important. And it was really then that it gave me an inkling of the radical preparedness that some people have to do evil on behalf of an idea. And it's led to a lifelong interest in trying to understand evil and ideologies. This was about the time when the Baader-Meinhof gang was forming in Germany. But back in Cambridge, I was immersed in medieval literature. Medieval basically means 12th, 13th, 14th century. Wonderful literature, extremely sophisticated, complex, colorful, full of symbols, full of ideas. And that was partly because in the Middle Ages, they had the idea that because God had created the world, he had filled the world with meaning. And you had to know everything you possibly could about anything, whether it was a jewel or a kind of tree or a bird, in order to get the nuggets of meaning that God had hidden into that creature or thing that had been made. And so literature as well was filled with meaning on lots and lots of levels, lots of symbols, metaphors. It was very exciting, wonderful literature. And I thought I'd just give you a little taste of a medieval German poem where the poet Oswald von Wolkenstein is trying to capture birdsong. So forgive me, here we are, he's trying to capture the birdsong of little birds. The little larks and others. Otzi und durch, durch, durch. Otzi, 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 otzi. Fiddly, 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 fiddly. So sang der Gauch nur Kawawa Kuku. And he goes on. He was a wonderful musician, and he captured in medieval language lots of different kinds of music of birds, including the nightingale. I thought the medieval world was very colorful, and I thought I'd show you the one sort of mock medieval thing I have. This is a reproduction of a medieval leather flagon, black leather inside, red leather on the outside. This was a sort of fairly typical medieval drinking. Middle Ages was a wonderful thing to teach. I absolutely loved it. In my German department, the Holocaust did not exist. Literature stopped in 1933 and it started again in 1945. I had a Jewish colleague who taught Holocaust studies in the history department, but it didn't exist in the German department. So for my first year students, I made sure that I taught them SS hymns, and there were lots of hymns dedicated to Hitler. Goebbels' speeches, Hitler's speeches, so that I could introduce and some knowledge of the Shoah to them. And I also would teach them some Romany language, 1 hour a year, German and English Romany. And I thought, just to amuse you, I would read you a little story in English Romany. So here is a little English Romany story. I'm very fond of Romanys, and on my many travels in Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, I've often spent hours and hours by the roadside with Romanys with their traditional caravans, and sometimes with hawks and hunting dogs and horses, chatting with them, and still do sometimes. So here's a little gypsy story. First of all, I'll tell you the translation, and then you can listen to it in English Romany language. One fine day, a gypsy was playing at cockshy, and he threw a stick through the window of a great house, and he broke the glass. Up came the policeman and said, "You must pay for the glass." But when they went into the house, they found the stick had killed a mad dog that was going to bite the child. So the lady gave the gypsy a gold watch and a good horse. But every stick that breaks the window doesn't kill a dog. So here it is in English Romany. Prejecarus divus, a Romany child was carin pious with the costas, and he wassid a cosh, a dree the hev of a borrow cur, and he pogged it. Up welled the prastramingro, and penned, "Two must pucker for the glass." But when they do dree the hev, when they do dree the cur, they lusted, the cosh had marled a juckle, a divio juckle, that was down to dant the chavo. So the Rani, dal a Romany chow, a sonakai ora, and a fine o'grai. But yet Costa that poggers a have doesn't muller a jackal. Anyway, it's a lovely story, rather ethical in a way, and I sometimes I know that story by heart, and I sometimes tell it when I'm with Romanies, and they're so delighted to hear the Romani language, which some of them still know well. I had a tenured lectureship till I retired, teaching medieval and Renaissance literature. Oh, let me just show you. Let me just show you something Renaissance. This is genuine Renaissance. I've got one thing which is genuine Renaissance, and this is a book, 1534, little book with parchment, bound in parchment, printed in Venice in 1534. And some of you will know that that sign means it's printed in the printing press of Aldus Manutius. It's the Maxims of, it's Valerius Maximus, which was the second most popular book after the Bible. And Aldus Manutius was a leading printer of the day. He invented the pocketbook. This is his format, and he was a great friend of Hebrew scholars and printers. Many of the printers were Jewish, and sometimes their daughters were also printers. And he was a great friend of Gerson Soncino, a great printer, a Jewish printer, and there is still the Soncino press, which you might have some books of. And he wasn't satisfied with the grammar that he had, so he actually printed a much better Hebrew grammar so that Christian scholars could learn Hebrew. So that's a nice little link to that book. But it was very strange. I felt rather cut off from reality in a way, teaching 12th, 13th, 16th century, but living in a very busy city. And then I became much more linked to the real world because I bought a house in King's Heath and there were lots of quite strange people going up and down. And sometimes it was quite troubling. I decided to sort of pray for them in a way. It's a silly idea, but I did. And I had the sudden idea of taking round a box of chocolates because I realized they all lived in one huge house, and I went and took a box of chocolates round and was invited in. And I found that I'd entered a kind of Hogarthian, terrible hostel. There were 30 people sitting down having a meal, and in the middle of the room, there were 30 people standing because they only had 30 places for 60 people. And I was shown around, and the conditions were so squalid. And this was the time, this was the late 70s. It was the time of the closure, the scandalous closure of the long-stay mental hospitals. About which Marjorie Wallace has protested so vigorously and rightly. And it has, you probably know, we lost Free and Barnet. It's one of the terrible scandals of our age. Instead of being renovated and made into the wonderful sanctuaries that they were supposed to be, they were sold off. And the poor people who lived in them were simply decanted into the non-existent community. And in this hostel, they walked the streets from 9 in the morning till 5 at night when they were let back. And I started visiting regularly, and I got very involved when a young woman ran away, started living in the Lewes in King's Heath, and I would go and visit her in the evening and push fish and chips under the door and chat to her. And then the local radio heard that she was there, and I went to the police and said, look, please take her in somewhere safe because she's very unsafe in the public Lewes. And they said, no, you must, she'll have fleas, she'll smell bad, you've got to take her to the delousing centre in Winston Green Prison and onto the Salvation Army. So I did, and I started entering another world really of the destitution of very mentally ill people. And I got to know the social workers, the mental health team, and I pleaded with them to open a day centre. They thought this was a good idea, but hadn't any idea how to do it. And then one day I was actually taking part in an amateur production in the Birmingham Hippodrome of a musical based on two sisters, not Jewish, who were sent to Ravensbrück for having, two Dutch sisters, for having sheltered a Jewish family. And there was, I was understudy, and I was being the understudy on stage, as the older sister was singing about a home which she hoped the two sisters would create after the war for survivors, Jewish survivors. and she was describing how beautiful it would be. And I was in floods of tears because that morning, the social workers had phoned me up and said, we've decided that we're going to move upstairs. We have a big Edwardian house with a garden. We'll move upstairs if you will make a day centre. So it was a wonderful opportunity. It was quite a big house with a lovely garden. And Stephen, who is my fiance, and I and some friends simply painted it, filled it with furniture from our houses and charity shops. And I went to all the local churches and synagogues and pleaded with them for volunteers. And I made a rota of 40 volunteers who would do 2 hours in groups of 2 each every fortnight. And within 3 weeks, we were looking after 100 mentally ill people all day. And it was so exciting because all sorts of things happened which we hadn't anticipated. For one thing, we went to all the charity shops and said, please give us all your clothes that you can't sell. And we went to our friends and said, please give us your clothes that you don't want. And we had a wardrobe, a large wardrobe, and people who were often in rags could buy lovely clothes after trying them on individually in a privacy with a mirror and a volunteer to help them. And we charged 5 pence for a suit, 1 pence for a shirt, half a p for a tie. So they had the dignity of purchasing, but for very little money. And one of my proudest moments was when the shepherd, who had been the shepherd where Birmingham Airport was built, and he had a nervous breakdown when he lost his flock, he lost his pastures, and never recovered, and was put into a long stay hospital. And when I saw him striding along, looking so happy in a 3-piece suit, feeling himself. It was very moving. We had police brought in one day, a tiny little wizened creature called Eric. He had been found in a house just a few doors along from me. Neighbours had noticed that his mother hadn't gone in or out for a few days. Police broke the door down, found her corpse, and this little person, little mannequin beside her, and nobody knew he existed. He was at least 40 years old, and she must have had him out of wedlock and hidden him. He'd never been in the garden. He'd never been out of the house. He could only speak in whispers because she was so determined that no one should know that he was there. She was so ashamed. And he was absolutely taken to everyone's heart, and he found a family, he found a community. He didn't survive all that long because, of course, he had no immunity, but he was much loved. And at his funeral, there were so many of us, the other fellow people from the centre and the volunteers who were there to mourn him. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And I fell in love with that kind of activism work, and I was still lecturing full time. I was in love with Stephen, and I fell in love at the same time with Judaism and the Jewish community. A neighbor had taken me a year before to Yom Kippur in Central Synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue. And I was so fascinated and so overwhelmed by the experience of Yom Kippur that I went to the editor of an arts magazine for whom I used to write and said, please commission me to write about the Jewish community so that I can get to know them. And he did. And I went to the only person I knew at the university who was Jewish, who was Martin Goodman, who some of you will know. He became professor at Oxford. He's written wonderful books on Judaism and the Jewish Judaism during the Roman period. And he gave me phone numbers of lots of people, the lady who ran the mikveh, Irma Speyer, the lady who ran the Soviet Jewry Committee, the editor of the Jewish magazine, and several others. And I interviewed them, several Rabbonim. And I just utterly fell in love with the Jewish community. And within a few weeks, I was on the Soviet Jewry Committee. I'd been invited to Friday nights. I'd acquired some Yiddish momas. I became a close friend of the lady who ran the mikveh. And was asked to give a lecture in German to a German-speaking intellectual group in the Jewish community about Jewish life in the Middle Ages, about which I knew nothing. Although I'd studied at 3 universities, I had never, ever heard anything about Jewish life in the Middle Ages. And it was so intellectual, literate, and rich and fascinating. Jewish women in the Middle Ages had far more freedom than Christian women did, by the way. we got to know a lot of Israelis living in Birmingham, and we had a private honeymoon in England, and then we had a very public honeymoon, staying with lots of different Israeli friends. We were driven up the Golan Heights by a general who had helped driven a tank regiment up there. We were already Zionists before we went, but we came back absolutely passionate Zionists. And when our sons were born, we sent them to the King David Primary School because we wanted them to grow up as friends of the Jewish people. I became chair, I think perhaps I was already chair of the Friends of Israel Association, which was for Jews and non-Jews. And we had 200 members, half Jewish, half not Jewish. It was a nightmare knowing when to start because the Christians arrived a quarter of an hour early and would be standing at the doors long before anybody else was there. And the Jewish people would arrive a quarter of an hour late. And it was marvelous. We had monthly meetings, absolutely. There was so much positivity towards Israel in the early 1980s. It was very exciting. I went on a tour of Israel with the Zionist Federation, the only non-Jew with them. And I found, I'd already been to Yad Vashem with Stephen, but I found in the sanctuary of Yad Vashem, listening to the Chazan, intoning the names of the death camps, I felt very strongly that I actually must make a decision to stand alongside the Jewish people and to leave academic life. So when I got back, I took early retirement, meaning that I could be part-time for 3 years and then leave completely. And in that time, I set up the Israel Information Centre. I went to the local Rabbonim and said, do you have a tiny little room somewhere which I could use as an office? And eventually I was given the 36-foot long, old, abandoned Hebrew school at the top of Singers Hill Synagogue, a wonderful, historic, beautiful shul, with an office in it, and turned it into a lovely, beautiful Israel Centre for the West Midlands. And we put on lots of exhibitions and events. And for example, the Catholic Church had a pilgrimage to Israel, again, about 250 people. And in the shul hall, which had one of these lovely glitter balls, as shul halls did in those days, we put on a lovely Israeli dance and talk and food event for them before they went. And when they came back, we put on a different kind of event for them to try and deepen their love of Israel. And that's the kind of things we did. The Jewish bookseller, Manny Gorfunkel, retired at that time. So I took in all his books and kippot and mezuzahs and so on. And it became a center to which people came to buy all sorts of things, Jewish cards and books. And it was a very exciting, wonderful period of my life for 2 years. And that's when I met my first Jewish Auschwitz survivor. I'd already met a Romani Auschwitz survivor when I was hitchhiking in France many years before, but that was when I met my first Auschwitz survivor, who had married out, and I would invite him regularly to events within the Jewish community, and he would arrive at the door, very strongly scented, immaculately dressed, and run away. And it was then, I think, really that I began to realize the trauma, the long-term effects of massive, massive trauma. I would often see him privately, but one-to-one, but he could never bring himself to cross that threshold. A couple of years later, I was asked by Rabbi Norman Solomon, who was on my advisory board for the Information Centre, if I'd join him as a fellow academic in his Centre for Judaism and Jewish-Christian Relations. And that was wonderful. It was a learning period. I learned to lecture on things like Jewish ethics, Jewish history. He and I would do a kind of a double bill. We'd go to theological colleges and he would do the beautiful stuff. He would talk about Jewish mysticism and Jewish prayer and liturgy. And I would do anti-Semitism, the history of anti-Semitism, because I was still formerly an Anglican, and we were speaking in Anglican or Baptist or Roman Catholic theological colleges. I could say, this is our Christian history. And they really had to listen and take it seriously. At that time, I also went to Remembering for the Future, which was the amazing first ever international conference on the Holocaust in Oxford, in Britain. with Holocaust survivors and academics from all over the world, paid for by Robert Maxwell. He put 4 million of his own money into it, and pioneered by his wife, the wonderful Betty Maxwell. And he was in tears at the reception. I think he felt a very strong fellow feeling with Shoah survivors. It was an exciting time. I lectured all over Britain, and I lectured in Finland, USA, Germany, Israel. I used to go every year to the Binyanei Ha'umah at Sukkot, because there still are probably 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 Christian Zionists who go there for Sukkot, and have lectures and go in processions with the Israeli Sukkot processions. And I'd usually be lecturing to 2,000 or 3,000 at a time. And whatever I was lecturing about, I made sure that for the first 5 or 10 minutes, I spoke against mission and in praise of Judaism, because I'm afraid some did, and probably still do, have some idea of an ultimate conversion of the Jewish people. And I'm absolutely adamantly against that. And I got into trouble for it, including with some bishops. I discovered in Birmingham that missionaries can be quite devious. I was a friend of Rabbi Arkush, who was a Chabad rabbi, who was there to combat missionaries. And there was an Anglican clergyman who was close to the Jewish community. I often met him at Jewish events. And I asked him what he was doing there once or twice. And he said, oh, I just love the Jewish people. And one day I got a letter out of the blue inviting me to a prayer meeting with him and others to pray for the conversion of the Jews. And I was horrified. So I went to him in his home and I said, look, who are you really? And he admitted then that he belonged to the CMJ, which used to be called the Church's Mission to the Jews and is now called the Church's Ministry Among the Jews. And I said, look, either you go to the Rabbonim and say who you are. I know I seem quite meek and mild, but I sometimes could be quite fierce then. Or I'm going to the Rabbonim and I'm going to tell them who you really are. And he did go to the Rabbonim very quickly. And his wife was actually pleased, because she said that it had been making him ill, the deception. The Rabbonim were wonderful. They said to him, we will give you 6 months to get out of Birmingham and we will not unmask you, but we're going to watch you like a hawk. And if you put a step wrong, if you make one move towards trying to convert any of us, then we're going to tell the community who you really are. And he did leave, and the Rabbonim behaved with extraordinary discretion and dignity. And I was very impressed by them. It could be sometimes quite exciting. I mentioned once or twice, I suppose, that once I was invited to speak to 2,000 Black Pentecostalist leaders and their wives who were at a big convention in Birmingham. I wondered how I should begin. And I decided I would begin by saying to them, look, you must be aware that your Jesus was a rabbi. And he will have taught, do you know what he will have taught, like all the other rabbis of his day? He will have taught that a husband must spend more on his wife and children than on himself, and he must ensure that his wife has a regular and generous supply of clothes and perfume. And it brought the house down. It was fantastic. All of the wives turned to their husbands and said, did you hear that? Did you hear that? Because, of course, this is very far from anything in Christian teaching. When Stephen got a consultant post in London, I got a post as a research fellow on anti-Semitism at the Institute of Jewish Affairs, which specialized in anti-Semitism. Occasionally, I wrote on things like Shinrikyo, which was an anti-Jewish cult, which was hoping to cause mass genocide by the use of sarin, poison, in the underground. But at that time, and I wrote a lot on anti-Semitism, but at that time, anti-Gypsyism was even worse. And so very generously, the Institute of Jewish Affairs said that they would publish, if I wrote it, a long report on the history of Gypsies in Europe, Roma Gypsies in Europe, and their persecution during the Holocaust and in 14 countries after the Second World War. So I did. Some by this time, our son had become quite ill, so I couldn't go to Paris where most of the archives were, but instead I used the archives. Another amazing Jewish man, Donald Kenrick, who became a good friend. He was discovered later, he was Britain's greatest polyglot. and he was one of the world's greatest polyglots. He had 60 languages. And when he had gone to Bulgaria, as one does, to learn Bulgarian, he'd encountered the the Roma, and had utterly fallen in love with the Roma people. And so this wonderful, shy man who lived in Ladbroke Grove, with a vast archive on the Romanis, had devoted the rest of his life to supporting the Roma people. And he was the secretary of the Gypsy Council of Great Britain, and an amazing man. And it was a great joy. And I met a lot of Roma through him, including one who's half Jewish, half Roma, and who lit a candle in the Holocaust Memorial Day, the government Holocaust Memorial Day 2 years ago. I mentioned that Joshua was, I should just mention my one Prince Philip anecdote. I was on the CCJ at that time, and I was asked to go to St. James's Palace to a reception, and I had to introduce 9 other people to him. That was the way it's done. When one person is chosen to talk, first of all, to Prince Philip, and then to introduce the others. And Stephen and I had discussed what would be the least controversial thing that I could talk about. So I decided, when I knew he'd asked me what I'm doing, I said I'd just written a report on the history of the Roma Gypsies in Europe and their persecution. And he said, "Dreadful people, load of criminals. Next." He wanted to go on to the next person. He didn't like that at all. He was, I suspect, being very typically Prince Philip, despite his many wonderful qualities which we've been learning about. Our younger son Sam developed a very rare brain illness. Had already done that when he was 8. In and out of hospital for a year, off school. Lost 40 IQ points very quickly and became neurologically crazy. And after a year had to go to a medical boarding school for children with very special needs or serious illnesses. So essentially, my career stopped. I became a special needs mother, really, for several years. And although I did a bit of lecturing at Spiro Institute and the LJCC, I knew that I wouldn't go back into any kind of real career academically until Sam was 18. And then when Sam was 17, our son, just after I had spent a term lecturing on genocide at the LJCC, suddenly 3 days before Christmas, Joshua didn't wake up one morning, age 20. And my life changed, really. It's a life-changing thing to lose a child. It's not like any other bereavement, especially when it's so sudden. It's extraordinarily traumatic. And I've since realized, belatedly, that it's not only the intense anguish and grief, but it's also massive PTSD. And I have to say, many bereaved parents not only lose their son or daughter, but they lose all of their, or many, or sometimes all of their friends and family, and become even more isolated. Because the PTSD can be so massive that people don't understand it and cannot understand their anger, or that they can't get over it, as people do from other bereavements in time. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, maybe. I want briefly to mention one or two wonderful friendships that I've had with secular Jewish women, and have been really very important in my life. One was with Gillian Becker, who wrote a book about the Baader Meinhof group. She set up the first institute for the study of terrorism in Britain. She wrote a wonderful book on the PLO, absolutely passionate atheist. She still is. She moved to California some years ago. But she was also driven by the need to understand evil. And she and I would spend many hours discussing ideologies together, and our awareness that men will kill for an idea when they wouldn't kill for any other reason. And that was true of the Cambodian genocide, which was actually plotted by about only 6 or 7 men who had all studied at the Sorbonne together and had all imbibed the ideas of Frantz Fanon and Nietzsche and other people, and out of that actually formed a genocidal ideology, which they put into terrible practice in the Cambodian genocide. I became very interested in genocide, and I wrote a chapter after attending a conference on the churches in Rwanda. I wrote a chapter on the complicity of the churches and the appalling reactions of the churches in Britain to the Rwandan genocide, absolutely pathetic. I wrote about the Armenian genocide in the Jewish Quarterly because I became aware of German complicity in the Armenian genocide. Sorry, I'm not only going to talk a moment about genocide, but it's something that has interested me very much because the Germans created the first ever modern genocide in Namibia in the early 1900s. And some of those self-same soldiers were present in Ottoman Turkey in 1915 during the terrible massacre of up to 1 million or even 1.25 million Armenian Christians by the Ottoman Turks and by Kurds, with the complicity of the German army. And then some of the soldiers, German soldiers who were in Turkey during that Armenian genocide became leading Nazis, including Frank, who was head of Warsaw, ran Warsaw, and others. And Hitler, already when he was giving speeches about the future annihilation of the Jews in 1919, already knew in extreme detail about the Armenian genocide, which had happened only 4 years before, partly because his closest friend, Max Erwin von Schweigner-Richter, had been the consul in Erzurum in Ottoman Turkey at the epicenter of the Armenian genocide, and wrote lots of reports back to Berlin, and was an extreme German nationalist. And so he will have told Hitler in immense detail by 1919 about genocide, that it can happen, how it can happen, and that it can happen with impunity because Germany took in all of the main plotters of the Armenian genocide and gave them full military honors in Germany. Anyway, enough about that. Another dear friend was Helen Bamber, whom some of you may well remember. She lived in Muswell Hill, a wonderful, wonderful woman, also very secular, and she had spent her life devoted to assuaging the effects of evil. She went as a 19-year-old to Belsen to care for the dying and the survivors. When she came back, she cared for the boys, about whom that wonderful film was made in January, shown the Windermere boys, the 730 boys and a few girls who came out of the death camps after the war. And she founded, with a lady surgeon and with John Schlapperbeski, whom some of you will also know, a wonderful Jewish man from South Africa who's a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, which is now called Freedom from Torture. And we've been involved with it ever since. My husband conducts a symphony orchestra of doctors once a year in the Cadogan Hall to raise money for freedom from torture. And he's done that 11 years running now, except for last September for obvious reasons. I'm part of a group of Holocaust academics called the Roxton Holocaust Scholars, and we write books together. There are about 35 of us, mostly American, a few from Europe, and we have written quite a number of books together. We have 5-day conferences every 2 years in North Oxfordshire, and we decided we'd write a book against torture a few years ago, and I wrote a book. I wrote a chapter about therapies for torture survivors, and interviewed many of the therapists who worked at Schellwater and at the Medical Foundation, and in other torture centers, including Berlin. And last November, I gave a talk because I think it's very important that people understand about torture. I gave a talk to a lot of lawyers and doctors at the Medical Legal Society about torture and its consequences. One of the great loves of my life is Zionism. I've been to Israel over 60 times. I was brought up reading the Bible every day, and I still do. Especially the Tanakh. I mean, I don't read the New Testament anymore, and I haven't done. I last went to church when Sam was 14 years old. He's now 36. And I'm utterly rooted and grounded within Judaism. But I still read the Tanakh every day. And I really feel that with my own eyes, I have seen many of the prophecies about the eventual restoration of the Jewish people in their own land fulfilled. Like, for example, there's a lovely verse about that Ashkelon will be rebuilt. Ashkelon during the Middle Ages, when it was a crusader kingdom, it didn't exist. Ashkelon didn't exist until after the first Aliyah, and people began to restore some of the ancient cities. And I spent a day looking around Project Renewal in Ashkelon, which was so exciting to see Ashkelon not only rebuilt, but very, very beautiful. And I had the privilege of being at the foot of the steps of the first jumbo jet, which brought Russian immigrants after the collapse of communism to make Aliyah with flowers. And that was very moving. I also have seen something of the ingathering of the exiles at the other end. I had a friend called Phil Hunter. We used to share a platform occasionally at the Binyanei Ha'uma gatherings of Christian Zionists. I stopped lecturing to them in about 1999 for theological reasons. I felt I couldn't lecture to them anymore, but anyway, he was a remarkable man who sadly died a few years ago. He had a travel company in Hull. He was the sort of very devout Christian who read his Bible every day and prays every day. And he came across a verse saying that eventually the Jewish people will be brought home on the shoulders of the Gentiles. And he thought about this, and he realized he had a coach company, a tourist coach company, and he thought his coaches could be the shoulders of the Gentiles. So he got in touch with the Israeli government and the Jewish agency and told him his idea. And they loved it because in those days there were no flights from El Al to the Ukraine, only to Warsaw. And there were large numbers of Jews wanting to emigrate. This was in the 80s. To Israel, but didn't dare go by train or by bus because they were afraid of being robbed and because of anti-Semitism. And so he started sending in his coaches to the Ukraine and eventually Belarus. He invited me to go with him and see his operation. Actually, we went to Warsaw just before 9/11. We went to Majdanek. And on 9/11, we were in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, and I visited the grave of one of my great heroes, Dr. Janusz Korczak, who ran the orphanages and was one of the had finest understanding of children, almost anyone I know. And he sent coaches to, I went with one of his coaches to Chernovtsi. By that stage, Ella was flying into Kiev, and Chernovtsi was 600 kilometers away from Kiev, and his coach drove people with all of their luggage to Kiev. And it was a very moving time because pensions hadn't been paid for six months. It was a devastating time. We actually flew the day after 9/11 to Kiev. It was the Jewish New Year, and we were very, very shaken, having witnessed the events of 9/11 on Polish television. It was amazing to arrive in the airport, and it said, there was a huge sign saying Hasidim this way, because you will know that 20,000 Hasidim go from all over the world, and especially from Israel, to Uman, to the grave of, is it Rabbi Nachman? At that time of the year, and they're made so welcome by the Ukrainian authorities. And that was very heartening, and we went to Babi Yar. But all the way to Chernovtsi, there were people standing by the roadside trying to sell furniture or mushrooms or little anything, and nobody was buying. It was absolutely pathetic. And I decided I'd go and visit the chief rabbi of Kiev, and as we were talking, I could see out of his window in the courtyard there was a line of hundreds of people waiting in a queue. And in my naivety and ignorance, I said to him, "Oh, are they queuing for High Holy Day tickets?" And he said, "No. After we've had our long conversation, you go down into the soup kitchen and you see where they're queuing." And I went down, and there was a hearty meal with 3 slices of bread. And everybody carefully wrapped their 2 slices of bread in a paper handkerchief and took it home with them, because that was the only food they would have until the next day. People were literally starving in Ukraine at that time, and certainly could not afford medicine, often not afford heating. The destitution, including among the Jewish community, was terrible. And as soon as I got back, I contacted World Jewish Relief, And I've been a supporter of World Jewish Relief ever since. They do such amazing work in so many of the Eastern countries. Much later, I went on missions to Bulgaria and Romania with World Jewish Relief and saw some of their wonderful leadership training, people who'd been brought up with nothing, no Jewish identity, and giving them Yiddishkeit and a sense of identity and joy, and teaching them joy. Anyway, I'm passionate about Israel. Sorry, I must have a look at the time. Sorry, where is my watch? I do apologize. I've got a few more minutes. Yes, I'm allowed to carry on speaking for a few more minutes.
Yes, keep going.
I do apologize. Yes. By the way, I absolutely believe that Kimitzion Tetze Dora, Udevar Ad Hashem Mi Yerushalayim, Israel is not only the source of Torah and wisdom and knowledge, and will increasingly be so, because I have to say that among Christians, the Bible is less and less well known than it used to be. But Israel, think about what Israel gives to the rest of the world: drip irrigation, desert greening, afforestation, and so much more. It leads the world in vaccination. And I was privileged because I had a lot to do with WITSO. I went on quite a number of WITSO missions, and I spent time in WITSO day centers and child centers. And again, I became aware of how Israel is a pioneer in compassion. It has devised all sorts of ways of caring for children, for the elderly, for the disadvantaged, for those who've been who are very vulnerable or traumatized, in ways that are unique and very, very innovative. When I was running the Israel Information Centre, I did several fact-finding, went on several fact-finding tours. And for example, I was allowed to spend a day in the Alin Hospital in Jerusalem for disabled children. And I had recently been to Stoke Mandeville, equivalent. And it was a really gloomy place because the children were in bed. It was sort of desperately miserable, a very depressing place. Whereas in the Alin Hospital, it was extraordinary because there the engineers create a contraption. This is back in the 80s already. They created a contraption for every single child to enable each child to be mobile, whatever their disability. So the corridors were quite dangerous because there would be children zooming around everywhere on their wonderful contraptions. Another place where I spent a day was Bet Hatafutzot, which is the hospital for wounded soldiers. And I'd already heard a lecture by a top Israeli general in which he talked about Israeli soldiers as princes, that the Israeli military are always try to remember that within each household, within each family, the soldier is a prince. It was a very different way of speaking than people speak about squaddies. And Beit Hatafutzot was an extraordinary place, even in the 80s. It must be probably even more extraordinary now, because they understood that a wounded soldier has a wounded family, and that one must care not only for rehabilitating the soldier, but rehabilitating his entire family. So, for example, they had a shooting gallery where a father could play shooting games with his sons. They had table tennis for the disabled so that a father could play with his children. They had hairdressing salon so that the wives could have beauty treatment while they were there and be given an uplift. And they had, something I've never seen here, they had a device so that every car of every wounded soldier could have a wheelchair strapped to it and go onto the roof so that he could continue to drive his family independently. It affected me very profoundly, seeing Israel's remarkable compassion. I'm not going to talk about Wagner. That I've talked about Wagner in Muswell Hill a few times. But I used to lecture on the originals of on the things that wonderful works, Parsifal, Tristan, The Ring, the Nibelungenlied, which Wagner turned into his music dramas. And Welsh National Opera asked me to do 2-day conferences on him back in the early 80s. And I decided I'd read as much as I could by him, because he wrote about 8 books of long prose writings about what he was doing in his operas. And they were horrifying. because basically, in a nutshell, what he was wanting to do was to destroy the Jewish God. He hated Hashem and ethics, and he wanted to replace the Jewish God, essentially, as Nietzsche, his disciple, rightly argued, he wanted to replace the Jewish God and ethics and a biblical worldview, and ultimately the Jewish people, by a pagan god, Dionysus, god of Eros and death, and to be the force behind Germany. Already at the time of, already there were leading German thinkers who argued that Islam would have been a much better religion than weak old Christianity for the German people. They needed more oomph, more military prowess. Wagner took this much further. And there's a YouTube, just in case it interests you, there's a YouTube lecture by me on Wagner's musical religion, which I gave at the Hebrew University in 2013, which is the bicentenary of Wagner, which is followed by a lecture by Robert Wistrich, professor of Jewish history, on Hitler and Wagner, about Wagner's musical religion and its dire consequences. I personally believe that Wagner was one of the core inspirers of Hitler. Yes, I've just briefly mentioned the Roxton Holocaust Scholars. We had a very interesting book about hospitality to strangers, and there were 6 Muslims, 6 Jews. At that stage, well, I was actually within Judaism totally. I decided I'd write on Christian traditions of hospitality to strangers, where there were 6 Christians. And the Holocaust Museum in Washington heard about this and were fascinated. And they invited all of us to go and have a 3-day conference together in the Holocaust Museum, together with their staff, about the different concepts in the 3 religions of hospitality to strangers. It's perhaps not surprising that 2 of the Muslim participants, 4 of them were wonderful, 2 of them wrote on the subject of who am I allowed to kill? Which was a rather strange interpretation of the theme of hospitality to strangers. Compassionate Friends has been a big part of my life. Ever since Joshua died, I started feeling a great fellow feeling with fellow bereaved mothers and befriending them and having not parties, but gatherings of them in my home. And I think I had the first Jewish gathering of bereaved parents, which then became a formal Jewish bereaved parents group, which meets in this birth center. I just attended a regular monthly group until 2013, and I went to the annual retreats. But it went through a very difficult period and dysfunctional period. And rather unwillingly, I became a trustee, and then in early 2014, I really had to become the chair and a full-time CEO, because it was actually on its way to dying and disappearing. And it was, I'd never run a national charity, but fortunately, I had various friends, Jewish friends, who ran charities, and I went to all of them and said, what do I do? And they gave me very good advice. And Jonathan Sachs began to write his weekly Torah commentary on leadership. And I would avidly devour every word that he wrote, sitting beside Tamar, and try and put anything that he said into practice in the next week within the charity. And it was such a help. And his book, Lessons in Leadership, is which came out of those, his studies of Moses, absolutely fantastic book. It's now absolutely thriving. It has a Jewish CEO, it has a Jewish chair, a wonderful trustee board, and it's coped with COVID brilliantly, partly through our own Sharon Rose, who's on the screen with us, has done amazing things in the name of Emily, her beloved daughter. Sharon is now on our staff, a very, very valued member of our staff. Sharon helps to run events, and she's been at the heart of our provision of support online through COVID, and will be at the heart, I hope, of once we eventually all allowed to meet again. I can't praise Sharon enough. just as I also can't praise Tamar enough. Tamar has been a tremendous friend. Not only have I sat beside her in shul for decades now, but whenever we've had a crisis during Sam's terrible Sydenham's career, she took me on endless walks and was very kind. And when Joshua died, she and Anthony were absolutely brilliant and really galvanized the community. One of the reasons why we coped with Joshua dying was that we sat Shiva, and sitting Shiva was so helpful. The community rallied around amazingly, and lots of Holocaust survivors came, and they were among the most empathetic of people, having lost everyone in their lives, but they were so understanding of grief. And we will be eternally grateful to the Jewish community and to Muswell Hill Shul for how you supported us when Joshua died. And I'm hugely grateful to Sharon for supporting bereaved parents as you do now, and to Tamar for having been such a wonderful devoted friend. So I passionately believe in Israel and how important Israel is and how wonderful Israel is. In the early days, 40 years ago, when I got to know the Jewish community in Birmingham and fell in love with them, people would say to me sometimes, Margaret, when are you going to take off your rose-tinted spectacles and see us as we really are? But I've lived within the Jewish community for 40 years now. I don't have rose-tinted spectacles. I love the foibles and the eccentricities and the distinctiveness and the argumentativeness and the compassion within the Jewish community. You have so many marvelous qualities. You probably don't see them yourself, but being partly an outsider, I'm acutely aware of them. And one of the, of course, the strengths of Judaism is self-deprecation. That is not present in huge spades in Islam, and I have to say it's not present in huge spades in Christianity, but in Judaism there is such self-criticism, self-deprecation, but actually you rightly don't blow your own trumpet, but I'm very glad that I've had occasional opportunities to blow the trumpet for Israel and the Jewish people. I really do believe passionately that the Jewish people is God's segula, a special treasure. I'm in the process of converting formally at last, despite my awful jokes at harmony and humor, which some of you would have endured. I'm at last converting, sadly not through United, because Stephen isn't converting, but I'm converting through Masorti. And as part of that process, I had to write a very long essay, and I wrote it, I don't know, 15,000 words on Am Krovo, on the people close to Hashem, but also on closeness within Judaism, closeness within the Jewish people. And it's been my huge privilege to be close to the Jewish community of the Muswell Hill Shul. I have got a date to the Masorti Bet Din in May. The mikveh is still closed, but I'm hoping that once the mikveh is open, I will at last be one of you, as it were, partly because our daughter-in-law is Jewish, and our grandson, therefore, let me have a little bit of nachas. He's descended from the Maharal of Prague, but he knows nothing. His dear mother knows nothing. His dear grandmother knows nothing, because of she grew up in communist Czechoslovakia to Shoah survivor parents, who really she does remember going to secret shul services in the village where they were, and the town on the Hungarian border, where her grandfather had been the rabbi. She comes from a long line of rabbonim, but that was broken because of the Shoah. And so curiously, it will be to me that it will fall to teach him Hebrew and Shema and brachas and whatever he's going to know, and I hope that I'm going to be able to teach him much more than that. We've bought a house in Bromley, just 10 minutes drive from Beckenham, where Sam and Hannah and Joshua live. And I fell in love with the house, not knowing that it was in the same road as Bromley Reform Synagogue. So I'm in this very curious position of having only ever worshipped in United synagogues for 40 years, and where I love the liturgy and I love the chazanot and everything about it. I'm converting through Masorti, and I've become a member now of Bromley Reform Synagogue, which is very curious. There is fortunately an Orthodox synagogue in Catford, 2.7 miles away from the house, to which I will walk occasionally if I'm feeling energetic on Shabbat or High Holy Days, if I'm feeling desperate need of chazanut. And there's even the last surviving Wheatsoe group in Southeast London there, so I'll join that. But I'm only 2 minutes away in our new house and garden, which are both designed for entertaining, from Bromley Reformed Synagogue. I've already been shown round it by the rabbi, and I have had 2 long illicit black coffees with him in the in conversations. He's wonderful. I want him to meet Rabbi Mason. He's Polish. He comes from a family which lost 70 members of its family during the Shoah. He and his twin brother only learned that they were Jewish when they were 12 years old, because under communism and with Polish anti-Semitism, most Jews who had survived hid their Jewish identity completely. They'd changed their surname to actually an aristocratic Polish name during the war so that they would blend in more with the Polish people and not be discovered as Jews. And he only discovered that he was Jewish when there was a lesson at school about the feudal system and the aristocrats in Poland. And he went home and said, look, we have an interesting aristocratic name. Do we have any castles anywhere? And his father said, well, actually, I think there's something I better tell you. And he took him and his twin brother into another room and actually told them that they were Jewish. And it affected him very deeply. And his brother is now in Israel as a leader in Israel. And this young rabbi trained in Berlin and in Lübeck, and is a wonderful, wonderful rabbi. And he's already been headhunted by Edgware and Hendon Reform, but I'll have a few months of sitting at his feet. And I very much hope that he will meet Rabbi David Mason. I think they have a lot in common. So that is a great joy to look forward to. I shall miss Muswell Hill Shul enormously. I've missed it in the last year desperately. Oh, the Kiddushim, oh, the liturgy, oh, sitting beside Tamar, and so many others in the ladies' gallery. Oh, I will miss the ladies' gallery, because of course in the Reform Shul they don't have a ladies' gallery. But you have meant so much to me, far more than you'll ever know. And so I'm very grateful in the end to Judith for having given me this chance to say thank you to Sharon and Tamar and Judith and all of you. And it's been a great joy to be part of this wonderful shul and wonderful community. I just wanted to say that I do not think one has to believe anything to be holy or to be Jewish. One of the great joys of the Jewish community is that you can be utterly secular and passionately Jewish. It's one of the disadvantages of Christianity that it's what you believe that matters. Really, it's not. It's what one is, what one does, and the wonderful friendships and relationships one makes, and what one does in the outside community as well. So thank you for listening. Sorry I've gone on rather a long time, but I have gone on for my allotted time. Judith very kindly said I could speak for an hour. I have. But thank you for being so patient. Oh, there's a chap. There are 2 chaps. Oh, what an honor to have chaps with us. Gosh, hello.
Margaret, you've been amazing, absolutely amazing. We are all just spellbound by you.
I just wanted to show one more thing. Here, I wanted to show you, here is Gypsy art. This was painted by a Romany girl in Herefordshire, whom I got to know with horses living in a caravan. And these are flowers. These are flowers. Each flower was made in my presence while sitting by the campfire. Each flower is the tip of one willow twig made with a sharp penknife. Isn't that beautiful? There you are. It's my last little thing that I wanted to show you, to not to be too boring. Anyway, thank you.
Margaret, thank you so much on behalf of all of us. If you are okay with it, we'll definitely open up for people wanting to give their own comments and congratulations to you. And we're definitely going to follow this up, finding out about the increased freedom for Jewish women in the Middle Ages that you spoke about. And we're going to listen to your YouTube talk on Wagner's musical Religion, and so many other things. And I'm sure you'll be giving this talk to people you meet at the Athenaeum Club that you're now a member of. And it's just astonishing how wherever you've gone, you learn things, and then you see what needs to be done, and then you go ahead and do things. And it's a real lesson for us all. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
And everybody, welcome to unmute and share comments.
I have a question for you, Margaret, if I may. I was just wondering how the people organising the Masorti conversion programme that you're on, whether they were bemused at all by your devotion to the Orthodox sector.
No, I think they were rather sympathetic towards it. I mean, I have to say that really my main contact was Jonathan Wittenberg, though I also know I've been a friend for many, many years with Angela Gluck, who runs their conversion program, and actually didn't really want me to join it because she thought I might be not ideal material really for hers. So I had to do other things instead. But Jonathan Wittenberg was very sympathetic and absolutely understood why I wanted to remain within the United rather than joining New North London. I never dreamt for one moment that I would end up joining the Reform Synagogue. I mean, it's extraordinary. I can't believe it myself. And you know, our house is in a road which encapsulates my entire spiritual life. At the top of the road, Highlands Road in Bromley, is a funny little chapel called Rehoboth, which is strict Baptist, tiny little chapel. That's what I was brought up with. Halfway down the road is an Anglican church. That was my one act of teenage rebellion to become an Anglican. And at the bottom of the road is the synagogue. So down the road is my upward spiritual trajectory, as it were. So it's really quite bizarre. But no, I would much rather it were an Orthodox synagogue at the bottom of the road. But look, this is Bichette. Our garden was designed for entertaining. The shul has no garden. 2 minutes away, I think that I can imagine that there would be quite a lot of people, I hope, trekking up the hill to our garden because they travel to the Reform Synagogue from all over North Kent, including from Tunbridge Wells, where I grew up, and all over southeast London. So people are driving very long distances to get there. And I can imagine that they don't want to drive home immediately or straight after Kiddush. They might well want to pop in and maybe have a buffet lunch, tea or something like that. So I'm very hopeful of having visitors. As I'm also hopeful of having visitors from North London, but during the daytime, because I know that North Londoners think it's a very, very long way. It's out to Siberia to go to South London, especially Bromley. But actually, it's in the evening, it's not such a bad drive.
Margaret, I'm going to read to you a couple of things that people said in the chat. So from Pam and Robert, what an amazing talk from a unique and wonderful Margaret. Thank you. Wish you all the best now and in the future. Love from Pam and Robert. Amalia Michaels wrote, you've packed so much into your wonderful life. We in Muswell Hill feel privileged that you've joined our shul and we will really miss you so much. So from the Mounts, we'll miss you so much. What a wonderful insight into your life and career. Love, Steph.
Thank you.
You are incredible.
May I just say, Margaret, we regularly make the journey to Beckenham because our eldest lives there.
Oh,
so he may not be far away from you. So
we should give you our address. That would be so nice if you'd pop in. That would be wonderful.
Well, yes, that would be lovely. We'd love to do that. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was so interesting, and thank you for the contribution you've made to the community and the shul over the years.
I could never repay all that I have been given. I just feel that I've been given such riches through being part of the Jewish community. Are there any other questions? You probably want to go and have some supper or a glass of wine. It's a shame that we can't all be together and have some nice refreshments, as one normally does after Rosh Chodesh. That would be so nice to gather again over some delicious.
Is there a Rosh Chodesh group in Bromley?
I don't know. They have. I'm being asked to join the education committee. So they have apparently they have a talk every quarter, and I've said no. We need talks much more often than that. So there will be opportunities to do things there.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Rose. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Margaret. That was Michael's club, the Athenaeum.
Was it? Ah, oh, I would have loved to have been there with him. That would have been so nice.
You know,
Yes.
at one time, Margaret, they wouldn't let women in.
That's right. It's still only 13% women. Not very many women do belong.
And secondly, is there any way that this will be recorded?
It is being recorded. It's
What? So
I have recorded it. Yeah.
Where will one can see it, or how?
That's a good question. I'm going to turn off record now because I think